An HOA board tried to erase me from my own home, confident rules would win, unaware the quiet neighbor they targeted spent decades judging housing discrimination cases from the bench. Let me start from beginning. The house sat at the end of a curved cul-de-sac, framed by trimmed hedges and a mailbox that never leaned. It was the kind of place that looked compliant by default, as if order itself had signed off on the deed. The neighborhood prided itself on appearances, on lawns that bowed to the same height, on doors painted within an approved palette that felt suspiciously narrow. I had bought the home years earlier, not as a statement but as a refuge after long days presiding over other people's disputes. It was quiet, predictable, and safely unremarkable, or so I believed. The first letter arrived with the cold authority of stationery chosen to intimidate. Heavy paper, formal formatting, a logo designed to suggest permanence and power. It alleged violations that were both vague and oddly confident: improper landscaping, unauthorized exterior modification, failure to comply with community standards. The language leaned on inevitability, as if the outcome had already been decided, and the letter merely served as a courtesy notice. I read it once, then again, noting how none of the alleged issues were specific enough to photograph or measure. The yard was maintained weekly, the exterior matched the approved design from the closing documents. The accusations floated, unanchored to reality, but heavy with implication. It was the kind of letter I had seen hundreds of times in case files, often sent to homeowners who lacked the time or resources to challenge them. The second letter arrived before the first deadline expired. This one escalated. Fines were mentioned, liens hinted at. The tone sharpened, no longer procedural but moral, as if the neighborhood itself had been wronged. It referenced prior warnings that had never existed. It cited sections of bylaws without context, daring the recipient to look them up and argue. I noticed something else then, something subtle but familiar. The scrutiny felt selective. Other homes on the street bore visible deviations that went unmentioned. A fence extended beyond approved height. A driveway sported an unapproved color stain. Decorative flags hung where rules technically forbade them. None had triggered letters. None had escalated. The third communication abandoned pretense. It outlined steps toward eviction through HOA enforcement mechanisms, a process rarely used but devastating when applied. It assumed noncompliance as fact. It framed the homeowner as defiant. It read like a verdict drafted before trial. Neighbors began to watch differently. The casual waves faded. The routine nods stiffened. The HOA had a way of circulating narratives without ever writing them down. Silence did the work. Assumptions filled gaps. The idea that someone must have done something wrong to deserve this kind of attention settled quietly over the cul-de-sac. I remained calm, outwardly at least. Years on the bench had trained me to separate emotion from process. Still, the weight of being targeted settled into the evenings, into the moments when the house no longer felt like a retreat, but a position under siege. The irony was not lost on me. By day, I evaluated claims of discriminatory enforcement, of rules applied unevenly under the guise of neutrality. By night, I was living inside one. I reviewed the HOA bylaws not as a resident, but as a jurist. Patterns emerged quickly: broad discretionary clauses, enforcement provisions that relied on complaints rather than inspections, language that allowed selective rigor. The architecture of plausible deniability was all there, familiar as an old casebook. What unsettled me most was the confidence behind the letters. Whoever was driving this effort believed resistance would crumble quickly. They believed authority alone would suffice. They believed the target would fold, sell, or vanish quietly, restoring the illusion of order. They had no idea who lived behind the carefully compliant facade at the end of the cul-de-sac. They had no idea that every line they wrote echoed arguments I had dismantled for years. And as the deadline in the third letter approached, the situation was clearly moving toward a confrontation that would not remain contained within the neighborhood much longer. The house stayed quiet that night, but the story had begun to lean forward, gathering momentum towards something far larger than an HOA dispute, setting the stage for consequences no one on the board seemed prepared to face. The escalation followed a predictable arc, one I had traced countless times in other people's lives. Once initial pressure failed, the machinery of authority leaned harder, mistaking persistence for righteousness. The HOA's next move was procedural saturation. Notices arrived more frequently, each one repeating the same allegations with minor variations, as if volume could substitute for evidence. Inspection reports appeared without inspectors. Photographs were cited but never included. Dates were referenced that coincided suspiciously with times I was not even home. The record they were building resembled many I had seen before, a paper trail designed less to document truth than to exhaust the recipient into compliance. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began to participate. Anonymous complaints surfaced, all echoing the same vague concerns. The language matched too closely to be organic. It carried the same cadence as the letters, the same emphasis on standards and harmony. The community had absorbed the narrative it was given and reflected it back, lending the HOA cover. From my windows, I observed violations far more concrete than anything alleged against my property. They stood in plain sight, unchallenged. When enforcement is truly about rules, inconsistency becomes the loudest evidence. Here, inconsistency was everywhere. The HOA scheduled a compliance hearing, a formality presented as an opportunity but structured as a confirmation. The documentation assumed guilt. The timeline favored the board. The outcome felt pre-written. It was the kind of process that gave the appearance of fairness while denying its substance. I prepared quietly, not with outrage, but with documentation. Photographs time-stamped and cataloged, maintenance records, copies of approval forms from purchase, comparative analysis of enforcement actions within the neighborhood, patterns of complaint timing, metadata that told stories paper alone could not. The most revealing discovery came from public records. Prior enforcement actions disproportionately targeted homeowners who shared certain characteristics. The correlation was not subtle, it was statistical. The board composition had remained unchanged throughout. The discretionary clauses in the bylaws had been invoked selectively, almost exclusively against the same demographic. By this point, the attempt to push me out had crossed from inconvenience into textbook discrimination. The threat of eviction was no longer an abstract possibility, but a lever being pulled with increasing force. Liens were drafted, legal counsel was mentioned. The HOA spoke as if ownership itself were conditional upon compliance with their unspoken expectations. What they did not account for was familiarity. I recognized the tactics, not because I had read about them, but because I had ruled against them. The structure, the pacing, the reliance on intimidation over substance, all mirrored cases that had ended with judgments, penalties, and policy reforms. The compliance hearing came and went in the official record, reduced to minutes that omitted context and amplified conclusions. The decision to proceed toward eviction was framed as reluctant but necessary. The language dripped with self-justification. Responsibility was displaced onto the homeowner, portrayed as uncooperative and disruptive. Outside the paperwork, the neighborhood grew colder. The isolation was intentional, a social pressure layered atop legal threats. It was meant to signal inevitability, to make resistance feel lonely and futile. Many would have cracked under that weight. Many had. Instead, I expanded the scope of my response. What began as a personal defense evolved into something broader. Complaints were drafted, not emotionally, but meticulously. Agencies were notified. Patterns were laid out. Jurisdiction was considered carefully. Walls that seemed solid from the inside often proved thin when examined from the right angle. The HOA continued to press forward, emboldened by the absence of immediate pushback they could recognize. Their confidence grew with each unanswered letter, each assumed victory. They mistook silence for surrender. As the eviction timeline solidified, the situation reached a point of no return. The board had committed fully to a course that, once exposed, would carry consequences far beyond one homeowner. The machinery was in motion, but so was something else, something that would soon force the HOA to confront a reality they had never imagined. The stage was set for a collision between assumed power and actual authority, and the next chapter would begin not in the cul-de-sac, but in a much larger arena. The unraveling began quietly, the way accountability often does. Notices from oversight bodies landed with a weight the HOA could not dismiss as easily as a homeowner's protest. Requests for documentation arrived, formal and precise. Timelines were questioned. Enforcement rationales were scrutinized. The same paper trail the board believed would protect them now worked in reverse. What the HOA had framed as an internal matter was reclassified as something else entirely. Selective enforcement, once exposed to external review, lost its camouflage. The discretionary clauses that once offered flexibility now revealed bias. The patterns that felt invisible within the neighborhood became stark when mapped objectively. As inquiries expanded, the board's confidence faltered. Their communications shifted in tone from declarative to defensive. Assertions softened into explanations. Explanations fractured into contradictions. The narrative they had curated for the neighborhood could not survive contact with regulators trained to look for precisely this kind of misconduct. The eviction process stalled. Legal counsel recalibrated. Risk assessments changed overnight. What had seemed like a straightforward assertion of authority now carried the potential for sanctions, civil liability, and public exposure. The cost-benefit calculation flipped, and the board scrambled to regain control of a situation they no longer understood. Meanwhile, the neighborhood watched a different story unfold. The certainty that had surrounded the HOA's actions began to erode. Silence gave way to curiosity, curiosity to unease. The idea that the board might be wrong, or worse, unfair, seeped into conversations that had once accepted the official line without question. The revelation of my profession did not come as an announcement, but as a matter of record. It surfaced through filings, through credentials attached to formal complaints. The irony was almost too neat. The person deemed non-compliant, disruptive, and unworthy of residence was, in fact, someone whose career had been built on evaluating fairness in housing. That irony carried weight beyond embarrassment. It reframed the entire conflict. The board's actions were no longer just questionable, they were indefensible. Every letter, every escalation, every assumption was now viewed through a lens they could not escape. The HOA attempted retreat. Offers of resolution appeared, carefully worded to avoid admission. Enforcement actions were paused, then quietly withdrawn. The eviction threat evaporated without explanation. Fines were waived, records were amended. The machine reversed itself as discreetly as possible, hoping to minimize fallout. But consequences rarely end where damage control begins. Oversight does not unsee what it has documented. Recommendations turned into requirements. Training was mandated. Policies were rewritten under supervision. Board members resigned, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. The neighborhood association lost its aura of unchecked authority. For me, the house returned to what it had always been meant to be, a place of quiet, a place of rest. The lawn remained trimmed, the hedges stayed even. Nothing about the property changed, because nothing about it had ever been wrong. What changed was the understanding of power within the cul-de-sac. The assumption that rules could be weaponized without consequence dissolved. The idea that compliance equaled worthiness was challenged. The HOA learned, in the most public way possible, that authority borrowed from bylaws does not outrank the law itself. The story did not end with celebration or triumph. It ended with restoration, with balance reasserted. The system that had been bent was straightened, not through outrage, but through process, not through shouting, but through records. And somewhere in the aftermath, the neighborhood gained an unspoken lesson. The quiet homeowner at the end of the cul-de-sac had never been powerless. The board had simply mistaken silence for ignorance and confidence for immunity. That mistake would not be repeated.